Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 828 for the 18th of August, 2024. Richard Saunders coming to you from a temporary recording studio somewhere in the world. Let's just leave it at that. Coming up on this week's show, it's a bit of a blast from the past. I read a review of a so-called paranormal special broadcast in Britain and Australia in 2000-2001. And this was called Beyond Belief, hosted by legendary interviewer Sir David Frost, and starring, amongst others, Uri Geller. Now, this was presented as a genuine show investigating or examining or showcasing paranormal feats. And what it turned out to be was just a farcical, bizarre, ridiculous hour or so of television. Now, luckily for us, the show is online and you can view it and chortle and giggle along. But this review is very interesting and it's worth listening to. And it's worth looking at these old shows to see just how pathetic, transparent cartoon the paranormal can be at times. Following that, it's the Australian Skeptics Newsletter this week, read by our relatively new reporter, Kat McLeod from Edmonton. What does Tim Mendham have for us in store this week, read by Kat McLeod? Then to round off the show in the Trove segment, we look at a series of letters to the editor from decades ago, more or less starting off with alternative health claims and morphing somehow into astrology. And this includes letters from various skeptics. I think you'll find this email chain. Email? No, it wasn't email. It was handwritten, or at least type. I think you'll find this chain of correspondence, shall we say, quite interesting. Well, no matter where you are in the world, I hope you're having a nice time at the moment. I sometimes wander out and photograph lots of interesting things. Maybe some birds, maybe some water birds. Any water birds near you? Are you taking nice photographs? I also like to take photographs of insects and flowers and, wow, these days with digital photography. Anyway, enough from me at the moment. It's time for me to run out of this little studio across the hall and eat a handful of peanuts with a nice cup of coffee. While I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the show and coming to you from the temporary studios here for the Skeptic Zone, I'm going to do a bit of a book of Tim. I'm going to read a story from the Skeptic Magazine. This is volume 21, number 2. And this comes from the year 2001. It's a story by the late skeptical investigator from Australia, Bob Nixon. Now, this is an important report because it relates to a TV show that was on at the time. And of course, well, these days, the TV show has found its way to YouTube, and I encourage you to look at it. In fact, I'll add a link in this week's show notes. And this was a paranormal special on London weekend television. And the report reads, like Deja vu all over again. Bob Nixon tunes in and finds an old acquaintance up to his old tricks. Very old tricks. This is a review of the television special Beyond Belief, which was broadcast in Australia on the Channel 9 network on the 23rd of May, 2001. It's Sir David Frost, for goodness sake. He's the man who interviewed my Uncle Richard and showed the world that he really was a crook. a man whose reputation for integrity sets him above the majority of his journalistic colleagues. Yet here he was with Uri Geller and a host of tricksters and bad actors, and the name itself should have been a clue. Broadcast on Channel 9 on May 23, 2001, this program came from Carlton UK Productions, made in 2000. I am on record as saying that Geller will one day rise proudly to his feet and admit to the world that it was all a trick and he was trying to teach the world a lesson. My feeling has always been that Geller likes the limelight more than he likes the money, although no doubt the money is nice. And watching the show, I could feel my prediction becoming more and more unlikely. The audience loved him, yet all he did was the same tired old tricks. The spoon bending, the watch starting, the picture duplication. Sadly, Geller has not moved on much from the early days of his career as a psychic. And I'll just add here that all these years later, almost 24 years later, Geller is still more or less doing the same shtick. Illusions. The show started with the old parlor trick of 4 people lifting another person using just one finger of each hand. The hands were placed above the head, but not pressed down on the head, as I learnt the trick. The 8 hands were placed one above the other. More importantly, they were placed above the level of the shoulder that they were attached to. They stayed in that position for about a minute, and then the volunteer was lifted right out of his chair. That such an old and well-known experiment opened the show as a clue to the quality that was to follow. Now, I'll just break in here to say the first time I saw that particular trick, I think I was in high school, or maybe I saw it on television, it's hard to say. And the way I understand that trick is that if 4 people try to lift a volunteer, a finger or 2 fingers under the armpit and the knees, then if they don't lift on unison, the person is very unlikely to be lifted. But if they do lift on unison, if they say 1, 2, 3, lift, then the combined effort is enough to lift the person. It's a very interesting psychological trick apart from anything else. We read on. Uri Geller cannot deny, whatever his current claims may be, that he started out as an illusionist, a stage magician. It's fair to say that Geller knows a trick or two, and I'd bet $1 that his library of magic literature is larger than mine. Yet even mine contains the effects that were performed by the other entertainers, who appeared on Beyond Belief. Blindfolds. Even if we take it as read that Geller has a mind with significantly greater wattage than the rest of us, he must surely have read books that contain a sort of techniques of making blindfolds that you can see through. Yet, when Boris Talchinsky donned his blindfold to perform 3 effects, Geller did not rush onto the stage to expose this Russian clown. Talchinsky used an interpreter, allegedly because he spoke not a word of English. Yet the interpreter spoke not a single word to the master, but he knew exactly what to do. Part 1 involved 9 objects placed on stands. A volunteer from the audience was to select one of the 9 and write it down on a sheet of paper. Only then did another member of the audience blindfold Talchinsky. Almost. In fact, the blindfold was placed over his eyes, then he removed it, adjusted it, and replaced it. The volunteer tied it, but Talchinsky, and I think that's how it's pronounced, had positioned it. A black bag was then placed over his head, and Sir David confidently told us, more than once, that Boris couldn't see a thing. Boris then wandered about with much arm waving and head jerking and selected the basketball from among items. He was, of course, right. He hadn't bumped into anything, had knocked over nary a plinth. Then, still blindfolded, Talchinsky was able to locate and hand a flower to a woman selected by a member of the audience. Now, when you watch this performance on the YouTube link, it is what's the word? What's the best word? Not quite pathetic. It's an act. It's clearly a carnival routine or a fun routine or a show. It's gobsmacking that was portrayed as anything other. We read on. Later in the show, Geller himself donned a wetsuit in a remarkable bit of nonsense, telling us that he had experimented with remote viewing between two submerged submarines and had found that water assisted with the process. He entered a large water tank and transmitted a command to Chalkinsky. While Boris went off to complete his task, again managing to find all the doors and avoid the walls, the television audience was shown the command, quote, "Bring the red roses from the makeup room," end quote. Could this indicate that Geller was not the only one to know the secret instruction? Boris, in fact, took a single rose from the vase and dutifully returned to the studio. This was only a minor flaw, perhaps, the result of Chalkinsky's limited English, but I suspect he was really only ever planning to take a single flower. It is, after all, a better trick to have a blindfolded man pull a flower from a vase. It seems more likely that the person who wrote the instructions was the one who made the mistake. Boris must have been livid. Throughout the feed, Geller sat peacefully in the tank, transmitting away merrily. Can it be that Geller doesn't know how this trick was done? Is it possible that he really did think he was transmitting a command and Boris was picking it up? Well, no. To put it plainly, Geller could not be aware of the trick being performed here. Sadly, Geller, the mental maestro, has allowed himself to be used as merely the beautiful assistant. Not that he was alone, but the other assistants were a good deal more beautiful. The show contained a host of British dolly birds, and that's a now really disused term meaning glamorous women. Dolly birds, most of them apparently famous enough for Sir David to call them by their first names. Geller got just one, and she was in Paris. Ulrike Johnson transmitted an image to Geller from across the channel, and Geller went ballistic with excitement when he was able to reproduce the simple image of the sun, although he missed Ulrike's happy face. And the spoons. For pity's sake, have we not seen enough of these yet? Geller bent a spoon using the same technique that is well known to skeptics. At the Great Australian Science Show last year, we killed dozens of spoons with this technique, and we'll do so again this year. Geller even started some watches. Ho-hum. There was a spoon bent in the audience too, and the young man who managed this feat assured Uri that he had not physically bent it. I wonder if there's any significance in the fact that this guy was the same volunteer from the audience who blindfolded Boris. Geller made a nice little move to give the impression that the spoon continued to bend right there in his hand. And I'll stop here to say, again, it's really worth watching this show. Apart from the really pathetic nature of some of the acts, it's always good to see the same old tricks again, and you learn a little bit more each time when you see them. Psychic healer. The other star of the show was Matthew Manning, a psychic healer. He did his bit of applied kinesiology on a woman calling herself Panther, and who is apparently a member of the British Gladiator cast. Now I'll just stop here again and say I viewed this just before reading this segment, and it was classic applied kinesiology arm testing routine. The same routine that some 7-8 years later would be used extensively with the scam of the power balance wristbands. We read on. Panther won the prize for having the nicest outfit on the night, and I confess that it was a wee bit difficult to follow what was going on around her. She thought a good thought, and Matthew was unable to force her arm down. She thought a bad thought, and he had no trouble at all. This particular effect was achieved with some grunting and groaning from Matthew. The fact that the muscles of the human arm, even a gladiator's, can't really support the weight of a full-grown man, yet Matthew did appear to be trying to place his whole weight on her arm. For the bad thought, he changed arms and touched her shoulder, and down the arm went. It helps too if the volunteer knows what is expected. Matthew Manning was there to show that the mind is a powerful and marvellous thing, capable of healing, along with other things Uri and co. were showing us. With the help of Hazel Courtney, a journalist, and Brian Rote, introduced as a pain management specialist, Matthew demonstrated this with a tub of ice. Hazel was asked to plunge her left hand into the ice, and a clock was started. She lasted 25 seconds before she had to pull her arm out. All the while, Mr. Rote described the sensations she would be feeling, the pain that low temperatures cause. All perfectly true, of course, and he was telling us this while the poor woman had her hand in the ice. Matthew then performed his healing technique, and Ms. Courtney plunged her right hand into the ice. Matthew had his hand on her shoulder and was being very intense, while Rote described how much better it would be now that Matthew had worked his magic on her. She lasted 50 seconds, twice as long, before she removed her hand, and said she could have gone on for longer. What we have here is a demonstration on how much difference is made by a supportive atmosphere and the power of suggestion. Nothing more than that. And I'll add to that, in the years since, there's been several studies, and I think one was done by the Mythbusters, using ice, using people with their hand in ice, that swearing, a lot of swearing going on, can help you keep your hand in the cold water for longer. Remote viewing and other nonsense. David Morehouse, author of Psychic Warrior, swapped images with Geller across the Atlantic. It was the same trick that Eureka had performed with Geller, only longer distance. Morehouse stared intently at a picture inside a manila folder. We could see the back of the folder, so we could be sure he was looking at something, but I wonder what it was. Perhaps he was checking his share portfolio. Geller drew a sort of UFO on pillars, and the image Morehouse had apparently been transmitting was revealed, not by having Morehouse simply turn the folder around so we could see it, but as a video clip. It was a building called the Rotunda in Washington, D.C. We could see it was a video clip because there were cars moving around in front of the building. No one mentioned the name of the building, and Morehouse simply smiled and nodded his agreement that Geller had got it right. Geller then held up a bottle and asked the audience to transmit the image to Morehouse. He got it, of course. Uri had the bottle in his pocket throughout the segment, and he and Morehouse knew each other. Let's not labour this point. Again, when you view the video, it's just not a very spectacular trick at all. It's not pulled off very well. Coral Polge draws dead people, a remarkable ability. With the help of Bill Landis, she then manages to link the dead person to a member of the audience. There was a nice-looking little old lady who was bossy and determined, keen to be the first person drawn. She was chosen as grandma by a young lady from the audience, although it seemed to me to be a bit of a stretch, and it took a long time for anyone to claim the old dear. Then came an old man, complete with mustache. He was claimed more readily than the bossy old dear by a pair of sisters in the audience. The technique here relates to cold reading. Bill would just talk and talk and talk until someone in the audience had heard enough detail to be able to match a couple of facts with their own dearly departed. Then the facts don't match can be safely ignored, and the adulation of the crowd enjoyed. My favourite act of the night was Oren and his dad Ronnie from Israel. Oren sees telepathically through his father's eyes. We had a little taste with a roulette wheel and yet another British babe. The wheel was spun, the ball dropped, and Oren was asked by the pretty girl, "Oren, what number has the ball landed on?" He correctly answered 2. The wheel is spun again, while Sir David informs us that the odds of getting it right are 37-1, and of getting it right twice is 37-1 multiplied by 37-1. The ball drops and Oren's dad asks, "Come on, Oren, you concentrate. What's the number?" Again, Oren is spot on with his selection of 13. Neat little routine, well known among mentalists. And just briefly, so you know when you view the show, it appears to be a simple code. So in this situation, we can assume that, "Come on, Oren, you concentrate, what's the number?" is a code for 13. The same technique was used later in the show when Ronnie and a new dolly bird turned up at the pub and were connected to a blindfolded Oren via a live video link. Oren was able to successfully identify things that were around the pub: a pound note, a drink, a packet of cigarettes, and the number of cigarettes it contained. He went on to successfully identify the name and shirt colour of 2 patrons. Before the routine started, Ronnie asked Oren if he could hear him, and he asked again when he got no response. There, dear reader, is your only clue as to how this one might be done. Firewalking. For sheer silliness, we must examine the show's climax. It was, of all things, a firewalk. Christine Thomas, who, with some work and a good stylist, could well qualify as a dolly bird, told us that once you focus your mind, you can walk on hot coals. And to prove her point, she did just that. Sir David, suitably awed, then asked Dr. Freebert Karger, a physicist and the nearest thing we've had to a skeptic for the night, how he could explain it. He did his best to try and said that anyone could do it. Sir David challenged him to do it, and he did. But Christine soon stole the conversation and reiterated her nonsensical claim that if you get your mind focused and in the right frame, anyone can indeed do it. It was, she informed us, an example of how powerful the mind is. I wonder what her course costs. And again, breaking in quickly, this is one of the most thoroughly debunked so-called paranormal or mind over matter subjects there is, firewalking. I need not go into it here. Shows like this make me wonder if anyone has been listening to the message of skeptical organizations around the world. Can it be, I wonder, that there are still people out there who think there is really something inexplicable about these tricks? Could it be that this entire show was just a way for Sir David Frost to meet young, pretty women? My theory about Geller holds. I think in years to come, Uri will announce to the world that what we saw in his show was just trickery, and he has been fooling us all these years to demonstrate just how gullible we all can be. And that was Like Deja Vu all over again by the late Bob Nixon, who was an investigator for the Australian Skeptics. And this comes from the Skeptic Magazine, volume 21, number 2, from 2001. And now you've been primed. If you follow the link in this week's show notes, you can view this special for yourself. But I would certainly recommend a nice drink or two before viewing.
Hello, this is Maynard. Did you know that you can listen to the Skeptic Zone on YouTube? Yes, I know, sounds crazy, but it's true. Also, you can hear 40 logical fallacies with Michelle Bickersma and funny sketches with Richard Saunders and a host of other skeptics. Just click on the YouTube links on the homepage at skepticzone.tv.
Hello, this is Kat McLeod here in Edmonton, Canada at Kitty Corner Studios, and this week I'm going to read the highlights from the Australian Skeptics Newsletter. Oh, you were expecting Adrian Hill? Well, at the moment she's lost in the wilds of Iceland having a great time. What a lucky loon she is. So, sorry, you get this loon instead. This is newsletter number 203, and remember, you can subscribe to this newsletter and receive it every other week in your inbox. The full newsletter includes more stories and links to all the stories mentioned. But now, let's see what Tim Mendham has for us this time. Hi all, says Tim. Some sad news and some good news. The sad first. The deaths of skeptics Jane Hansen, the journalist from Australia, and Mark Edward, the psychic buster in the USA. Short items below, but more in the next issue of The Skeptic, the magazine from Australian Skeptics. The good news, we are getting close to setting up ticket sales for the Skepticon 2024, but the speaker list is proving to be a host of excellent speakers on a host of interesting and diverse topics, headlined, of course, by our national living treasures, Dr. Carl and radio science presenter, Robin Williams. Read on. Okay, Tim, I'll do just that. Sad news, Jane Hansen and Mark Edward. We're saddened to report the deaths of journalist Jane Hansen and U.S. psychic skeptic Mark Edward. Jane was the first winner of Australian Skeptics Media Award in 2018. She won for her work on the anti-vaccination movement and her promotion of the successful No Jab, No Play / No Pay campaigns. Most news reports of her death covered her early years as a war correspondent and author of a controversial novel on abuse in the media. The News Limited site has more about her work exposing the anti-vax campaigns, but maybe behind a paywall. Mark Edwards was variously a punk rock entertainer, a performance artist, a magician, a high-profile, albeit skeptical, psychic, and then full-time skeptic exposing, with his partner Susan Gerbic, the tricks of the psychic industry. You can read more and listen to Susan's moving memorial, recorded just hours after his death, on the Skeptic Zone from last week. Skepticon 2024, Sydney, November 23 and 24. 2 Australian national living treasures will feature at Skepticon this year, Dr. Carl Kruszelnicki and Robin Williams. They are 2 of Australia's premier science communicators and will guarantee a refreshing and incisive comment on science and skepticism. Also appearing will be, among others, Ben Radford, paranormal investigator and deputy editor of Skeptical Inquirer, Alanta Cawley, science communicator, comedian, and convention MC, Josh Sepps, satirist and media presenter, young skeptics, high school students and their science projects, Philippa Miller, New South Wales Science Teachers Association, on teaching science, Annie McCubbin, actor, author, and corporate critical thinking consultant, Amelia Wilmer, journalist and founder of the Armadale Skeptics in the Pub, Paul Cropper, paranormal and cryptozoology researcher, Bill Chalker, UAP/UFO investigator, Sue Irachi, Australian doctor and emergency medicine specialist, Jason Evans, professor at the Climate Change Research Centre, University of New South Wales, and more to come. Skepticon 2024 will run from November 23rd to 24th at the Guthrie Theatre, University of Technology, Sydney, with an opening function at the Occidental Hotel in York Street, Wynyard, on the evening of November 22nd, the Friday preceding the convention. Tickets for the convention and dinner and the program of speakers will be available later this month. Bulletproof coffee for the brain? Is there evidence that moderate coffee consumption may improve cognition? Can you rely on questionnaires? Which one of the 1,000 compounds works? Lots of questions in this scathing article. You'll need a coffee afterwards. Can astrologers use astrological charts to understand people's character and lives? A new study puts astrologers to the test. Guess the result. Warning, this is a long article, which is fair enough for a scientific study. Read the summary for the fairly brief key results. Who enjoys magic? Research found 2 diametrically opposing personalities enjoy magic: skeptical, rational folk, and superstitious and paranormal folk. The same study authors developed the concept of loathing and legerdemain. LOL. Subscribers to The Skeptic will be able to read about this and lots of other aspects of magic and skeptics in a special feature in the September 2024 issue. Psychic News Magazine battles to survive. Psychic News, the journal of British spiritualism, which for close to 100 years has exposed fake mediums, but also supports a lot of strange things, faces financial crisis after subsidy is withdrawn. And yes, they do admit they didn't see it coming. All newspapers and magazines are facing this. Renew your subscription to The Skeptic now. And if yours is already current, buy one for a friend, or an enemy, or your local homeopath's office. Psychic clashes with Boy George. A classic of hot reading rebuffed and then success. The celebrity boy psychic Tyler Henry comes to read pop star legend Boy George, and surprisingly, he's never heard of Boy George, despite being sent to his house. For someone with his pulse on the dead, he doesn't know a lot about the real world. And it shows in this video, as George at first shakes his head and says no, and his manager bursts in to say, "Yes, you do." And if I were George, I'd sack the manager on the spot. But George turns when Tyler's research starts to pay off, and George gets emotional. Skeptics in action. If you have any ideas for stories or want to contribute to Skeptics communications, such as the magazine or Facebook page, or just have something you want to get off your chest, then you're welcome to get in touch. News leads should be sent to newstips@skeptics.com.au. Submissions for the magazine, etc., should go to editor@skeptics.com.au. Comments and suggestions should also go to editor@skeptics.com.au. And that is Skeptics with a K. Items of interest. Travel tip number 1. The 31 most haunted places in America. Usual culprits: hotels, cemeteries, old houses, mental asylums, even one whole neighborhood, and a zoo. Our favorite is a brewery in Savannah, Georgia, where it doesn't matter if you find a ghost or not. I'm sure you could find some spirits. Travel tip number 2. 7 airports known for paranormal activity. All in the U.S., and 2 of them in Georgia. Watch out for those mystery tours. Ghost tells conjuring house owner to fire employee. Is that unfair dismissal? A ghost tells the haunted house's owner the worker was stealing money. Naturally, it's been taken to court. Drum roll. Does he stand a ghost of a chance? 17 worst photos passed off as extraterrestrial. Come on, they're not all that bad. Actually, yes. Yes, they are. Intent shapes the supernatural universe. Quote, a teapot can brew a delicious tea, but it can also clobber someone on the head. The difference lies in the user's intention, end quote. Okay. Apparently, that principle, quote, represents the law of the universe. Anything can be used for good or evil, depending on the individual's motives, end quote, according to a Wiccan, psychic, and empath, Meryl Spizens. Silliest story of the week. Nothing lately from singer, psychic, ghost, and doll lover Brocade, so this category is blank. Surely there must be someone else out there. Well, that's all for this week. Wait, Tim, that's all? That simply won't do. Here's an interesting fact for you. On the 30th of July, 1987, Edmonton was struck by an F4 tornado, which peaked at a wind speed of 416 kilometers per hour. That's 258 miles per hour. It cut a 40-kilometer swath through the city, and in places it was up to a kilometer wide. 27 people were killed and more than 300 injured. It's one of the worst natural disasters in Canadian history, and I lived through it. So I suppose I won't complain about the hot weather today, even though I'm tempted. But for now, this is Kat McLeod signing off from Kitty Corner Studios in Edmonton, Canada.
Hi everyone, this is Susan Garbeck from the Guerrilla Skepticism on Wikipedia project. We're always looking for editors from all around the world. If you think this might be something of interest to you, please reach out to me at susangarbeck@yahoo.com, or you can contact me on Facebook. Please send me a friend request and send me a private message. I'd love to hear from you.
It's time once again to go back to the digital archives, the archives of newspapers, magazines, gazettes, menus, articles, items, bulletins, whatever they may be, digitized, stored for us to plunder, to research, to investigate. What an invaluable thing this is to have large parts of our past available to us for research purposes, and so we can learn to this very day. And doing some research recently on astrology. Oh yes, it's still around. I came across a series of letters to the editor in the Sydney Morning Herald from way back 40 years ago. Nearly 40 years ago, 1984, November 1984. So let's begin with a letter to the editor dated the 17th of November 1984. Evidence needed. And as was traditional, the letters begin with the word Sir. Sir, having more spare time than formerly, no, I'm not on strike, I have been listening to ABC and 2GB, both radio stations, broadcast some mornings, and have been amazed at the time given to self-professed experts in the field of, quote, alternative medicine, end quote, such as naturopaths, herbalists, homeopathists, iridologists, and purveyors of orthomolecular medicine. Orthomolecular medicine? That's a new one on me. After introductory remarks, phone-in questions are invited. These are mainly from women and cover a wide variety of conditions and ailments. The herbalists, naturopaths, etc., have answers for them all and glibly prescribe appropriate remedies, and remedies is in quotation marks, to the obvious joy of the eager questioner. I would agree that mostly they would do no harm, but I am staggered by the omniscience these practitioners assume with regards to diagnosis and treatment. If their remedies are so good, why do they not produce scientific evidence to support their unsubstantiated claims? For example, a herbalist today advised a woman to take a certain herbal infusion to improve lactation, warning that it was also an aphrodisiac. This claim could easily be tested scientifically by a double-blind trial, but I doubt that such a trial has ever been attempted. Another herbal remedy was prescribed to prevent sebaceous cysts, no claim being made that it would remove those already present. How on earth could such a claim be substantiated? I think it is time programmers, especially those of the ABC, looked critically at the free advertisement, names are always given, that they are giving to a host of esoteric and unscientific practitioners. Signed, Dr. Maurice Joseph from Newtown. So that was the 17th of November, and we have a response published here on the 24th of November. Natural therapists. Sir, readers of Dr. Joseph's letter, November 17, might be interested to learn that indeed there is a species of, quote, qualified professional natural therapist, end quote. Educational standards and codes of ethical conduct distinguish the professional naturopath, acupuncturist, herbalist, or homeopath from the unqualified lay therapist. Only the professional natural therapist is eligible for, quote, accreditation, end quote, and it is to the accredited practitioner that the community should turn for natural therapy, formerly deemed, quote, alternative medicine, end quote. Accredited natural therapists provide medical services which are accepted by most private health insurance funds, for example HCF, as items for benefits paid to contributors with extra tables. To gain accreditation status, the natural therapist must complete successfully a minimum of 3,000 hours of training, be established in private professional practice, belong to a recognized professional association with a code of ethics and standards, and be recommended as of good character. The, quote, scientific evidence, end quote, which Dr. Joseph also requires, exists, but not in the pages of those journals to which he and other doctors subscribe. No doubt. Nor the leaflets distributed and sponsored by the pharmaceutical drug companies. Oh dear, Big Pharma. It is substantial in some herbal and clinical nutritional domains, but is sorely lacking in others. Unfortunately, much of this material is not readily available to Australian doctors, and so they do not have the benefit to include it in MIM, Prescriber's Guide, and alike. The, quote, natural therapies, end quote, need the support of doctors who generally do not have closed minds to knowledge, only to ignorance and a lack of information. Quote, complementary medicine, end quote, advocated by Prince Charles on numerous occasions, is what would serve Dr. Joseph's profession, the community, and the natural therapists. Not confrontation based on lack of knowledge or information. Signed, Dr. Diane M. Wisner, Principal, New South Wales College of Natural Therapies, Greek Street, Glebe. And now we have a follow-up to that letter published on the 12th of December 1984. Medical Folklore. Sir, readers of Dr. Wisner's letters, November 24, in which she describes the accreditation of natural therapists, previously alternative medicine, may be misled into believing that such natural therapies have the imprimatur of the scientific medical community. However, the relationship between natural therapy and conventional medicine is analogous to the relationship between astrology and astronomy. The former is based on folklore, the latter on scientific observation. Signed, Richard Gordon, from Belmont. Now, I don't know whether that's the same Richard Gordon who later on, in the later part of last century, became the president of Australian Skeptics. It could be. Now, that reference to astrology caught the eye of, well, an astrologer. So we have a letter published on the 18th of December 1984. For astrology. Sir, ill-informed claims such as made by Richard Gordon, letters December 12th, that astrology is based on folklore sicken me. As a full-time professional astrologer and fellow of the Federation of Australian Astrologers, astrology has been studied for about 4,000 years and is a matter of history, not folklore. The ancient astrologers were the first astronomers as well. That is a historical fact also. Astrology is an ancient art/science that has done much and is continuing to do much to enable thousands of people to lead more fulfilled and meaningful lives. Astrology respects religion, responsible science, and above all, the dignity of all creation. And it deserves full credit for giving hope and a definite personal plan to many who find the world all the worse for the overactive stupidity of some political leaders and scientists. Goodness. Astrologers did not invent the atomic bomb, nor do we experiment on dumb animals, and I have yet to read that millions of dollars in public funds have been squandered in needless, repetitive, and useless research by any group of astrologers. It's about time that our puerile scientists attempted to do something that might add a little dignity to the world and the beings in it who have been brought to the brink of destruction by their brilliant scientific discoveries. Ray Webb, editor, Astrological Monthly Review, Newtown. And that letter brought a response from none other than Barry Williams from the Australian Skeptics. And this is published on the 27th of December 1984. On astrology. Sir, Mr. Ray Webb, letters December 18, in his defense of astrology seeks to take the moral high ground but ignores the central issue of the astrology debate, i.e., is it scientifically valid? The answer is that while astrology may or not be an art, it is demonstrably not a science. The central tenet of astrology is that the position of various planetary bodies at the moment of an individual's birth has a bearing not only on the personality of that individual, but also in some way governs his/her future actions. Not only is there no testable evidence to support such a contention, there is in fact a considerable body of evidence that utterly refutes it. It is interesting to note that Mr. Webb offers no view as to how astrology works, merely vague and unsupported assertions that it does. The fact is not surprising, for as soon as some astrologer hypothesizes the how of his art, then that hypothesis can be tested and proved right or wrong. No astrologer would want that to happen. Leaving aside the scientific side of the debate, what about the moral issues that Mr. Webb raises? Again, his arguments are non sequiturs. Astrology and astronomy have been around for 4,000 years? Quite true. And while astronomy has made enormous advances in our understanding of the universe in that time, astrology still clings to its outdated tenets. That is because astronomy is a science and astrology is a faith. Mr. Webb's attack on, quote, puerile scientists, end quote, who failed to, quote, add to the dignity of the world, end quote, is sophistry pure and simple. Does he really believe that the eradication of smallpox or the discovery of penicillin has not improved the world? These are only two of the thousands of scientific discoveries which have benefited humanity. What have astrologers done to equal this? His only positive argument is that, quote, astrology has enabled thousands to live more fulfilled and meaningful lives, end quote. If he means thousands of astrologers who have made a living out of it, perhaps he is right. If he refers to the thousands of people who, through gullibility or for some other reason, seek to leave the responsibility for their lives in the hands of practitioners of astrology, numerology, tarot reading, or a multitude of other pseudosciences, then his assertion is highly contentious, to say the least. Barry Williams, Chairman, New South Wales Branch, Australian Skeptics, Waverton. What fun it was to, well, more or less stumble across that chain of letters to the editor. One letter sparking a reply, and the next sparking a further reply, and so on. But it just goes to show that when you visit Trove at trove.nla.gov.au, or if you go to your library and you look up the microfilm, or any digital resource from published newspapers, well, you never know. You never know what you might find. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast, and thank you to my Patreon supporters and PayPal supporters at skepticzone.tv. You can sign up there, who keep the show going. I very much appreciate your ongoing support. And if you go to skepticzone.tv, apart from seeing the link to the video we discussed today, the TV special Beyond Belief, you'll see on the right-hand side a QR code for Skepticon, the Australian Skeptics National Convention, coming up in late November this year, with a host of international and local stars, including the one and only Ben Bradford. Can't wait to see Ben in Australia. And very soon, maybe even next week, we'll be discussing the various ticket options for Skepticon. But for this week, again, from a secret location, which happens to be a cupboard I've converted into a temporary recording studio, this is Richard Saunders signing off.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for episodes and show notes with links going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone on Facebook, X, TikTok and YouTube by clicking the links at our homepage, together with links to support the show financially via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed by our guests are not necessarily those of the Skeptic Zone podcast or any other skeptical organisation.